All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. We know that we have the unenviable position of being the post-lunch panel for you guys, so we are going to try and keep it light and informal and fun and make it as engaging as possible, and welcome also questions that you all may have after we get through kind of the introductory remarks and first round of questions that I will have for folks. So welcome to our session on subnational collaboration to amplify ambitious climate goals. I will be your moderator. My name is Aimee Barnes. I am the CEO of Nani Partners. We're a woman-owned consulting practice working on seeding and scaling solutions to the climate crisis. We do a lot of work at the subnational level. My background has been in subnational climate policy, working with a lot of the people on this panel in a previous life in California state government, working for former California Governor Jerry Brown. So really excited to be here in conversation with this incredible all-female panel for you today. So just to give you a little bit of an orientation about how we'll run this panel, I will introduce each of our speakers and kind of give them an opportunity to make some introductory remarks about what they're working on, their thoughts on the topic at hand. Then we'll do sort of a first round of questions to stimulate conversation amongst the panelists. Like I said, would love to get questions from all of you in the audience as well. I have some in my back pocket if you guys don't have any, but would really encourage you to think about them as we're talking. The knowledge of the people here before you is really deep and incredible on this subject. So please take advantage of the opportunity to ask them what's on your mind. All right. With that, we will get started. So I'm going to first introduce Anna Lising. Anna is a senior climate advisor for Washington Governor Jay Inslee, one of my favorite climate governors and a real leader on climate. Anna is a Filipino immigrant, mom of 3, 2 humans and a dog. Most important qualifications here right up front. And she develops and leads Washington's strategic agenda related to building decarbonization, clean transportation, climate justice, renewable energy, and transmission. And she has over 15 years of experience working on clean energy and has held leadership roles at the federal, state, and city levels, as well as within clean tech startups. Anna has also been in the midst of a rockin' legislative session, so we are really, really lucky and delighted to have her with us today. So I know there's been a lot of interest in what's happening in Washington. Anna, would love to just kind of get your thoughts on what the state of play is in Washington right now.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for having me. It has been a really busy time, but working for Governor Inslee on climate, it's always a busy time. So I'm really excited to be joining you all. I think, there's a lot happening in Washington state. We've, over the past several years, have passed some pretty significant pieces of climate legislation, from our Cap and Invest program, which I know everybody has been talking a lot about over the past couple of days here at this conference, to our Clean Energy Transformation Act, which actually sets us on a path to have 100% renewable electricity by 2045. We have the country's first and only statewide building performance standard program. So we've been passing this suite of legislation and really focus on implementing that and getting these programs stood up while we continue to push the envelope on things like expanding our building performance standards program. And right now I'm in the thick of negotiations to get our largest gas utility to decarbonize and actually have, hit net zero by 2050. So there's just a lot that we're focused on. We also passed statewide building energy codes that would basically prohibit gas furnaces and heaters from all new construction, both commercial and residential, starting July 1st of this year. So there's a bunch of things that Washington State has set into motion that we are really just trying to now put into practice, and the implementation details get to be pretty complicated, but so I think that's where we really like to partner with other states who are charting the same type of path, or maybe, either a couple steps ahead of us, like California, we learn a lot from, and actually work really closely with our friends in California on things like building and clean transportation efforts, as well as, trying to then pass that along to other states, like through our partnerships with the U.S. Climate Alliance and Pacific Coast Collaborative. We're always looking for opportunities for figuring out where do we have shared priorities, what are the policies that have worked in which states, and we even get down to the weeds of what tactics politically did you have to utilize to get regulations adopted, how did you work with stakeholders, et cetera. So I think that's what I'm really excited to talk more about today.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And I think, as Anna just mentioned, one of the things we're going to talk about on this panel about subnational collaboration is obviously what individual states and cities are doing, how they coordinate through some of the mechanisms like U.S. Climate Alliance. I know we'll hear about some C40 work, and then also getting into some of the weeds of like specific areas of cooperation that have been really fruitful. So on buildings, transportation, things like that. So next we'll go to Sarah-Jo Szambelan. Sarah-Jo is the international liaison at the California Air Resources Board, where she leads and facilitates collaboration with jurisdictions around the world. And this is a role that's near and dear to my heart because this is a role that I worked very closely with when I was at Cali, PA. And so, the amount of cooperation that CARB and Cali, PA do with other jurisdictions domestically, but also internationally, is really incredible. And so Sarah-Jo is the person who is behind all of that, which is a huge undertaking and an incredible job. She has 15 years before this in the nonprofit sector, leading research on stakeholder engagement to inform climate, energy, and transportation policy. So Sarah-Jo would love to hear a little bit more about what you're up to at the Air Resources Board in your role.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I know that you've heard from some of my colleagues already at this conference about just CARB's role in general, but just to give a little bit of background there. So we were founded in the 60s to address air quality challenges here in the Los Angeles area. And I mention that because it was before the EPA, the federal EPA, was started and kind of kickstart some of our subnational engagement, particularly around air quality and vehicle standards. And after California's landmark climate policy was passed in 2006, AB 32, there was written into, two things I want to say about that law. It was short, but in it was language that California had to cooperate with other jurisdictions around the world to address the global threat of climate change. And the second thing is that it left open to agencies in California to really develop all of the programs and policies that are California's climate strategy today. And the California Air Resources Board is the primary agency responsible for developing the strategy and the suite of policies and coordinating them to meet our climate targets. As you may know, last year was a big year in California for climate legislation. There were a number of bills that passed that really strengthened and codified a lot of our ambition. The most notable is our carbon neutrality target by 2045 or sooner. And now that's in state law, and we have to adjust all of our programs and policies to try to meet it. In my role, we get a lot of interest from jurisdictions around the world, not just across North America, which I know kind of is the topic of this conference, and we end up hosting a lot of delegations that come through to learn about pretty much everything we do, from air quality to fuels work to vehicle standards, cap and trade, all kinds of different policies. And it's a really important and exciting work. And Aimee was mentioning in my previous role, I wrote a lot of research papers, and I would kind of casually write the sentence about how states were the pioneers and would teach others the pioneering climate policy work that they did. And now I actually get to see how that happens. As Anna was saying, it's a lot of talking about the nuts and bolts and the political realities of how things actually get implemented. So really excited to be here and have this conversation today.
Great, thanks so much. And last but not least, Lauren Faber O'Connor, recently former Chief Sustainability Officer at the City of Los Angeles. I so I've known Lauren for a long time. She's an incredible climate leader in our space. I saw one of her posts on social media where she was sort of summarizing what she had done, and it's just like a punch list for anything that any person working in climate policy over the past, 5 to 10 years would have wanted to achieve. But just a couple of the achievements. First ever sustainable city plan brought stakeholders together to devise its successor, the LA Green New Deal, global model for local action on the climate crisis, led on subnational cooperation through climate mayors, internationally through Mayor Garcetti's chairmanship of C40. Lauren has had a long career in this space at EDF, working with the UK government, which is, I think, where she was when we first met. Just, again, somebody who really knows and has done a lot of the work that needs to be happening in this space, both for the city of Los Angeles and then in a collaborative way with other cities across the country and around the world. So take a victory lap, Lauren. Tell us.
The work is never done. maybe a deep breath, but sort of reflecting as you were describing our wonderful co-panelists and hearing the work that you're all doing right now, and remembering that, sort of early in my career, I did work for the UK government. I worked at the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. on climate policy, and this was during the Bush administration, and actually at the beginning it was the Bush administration in a Republican-held Congress. It then turned over in those midterms, 2006 midterms, into a democratically held Congress under George Bush, and so some of the politics around talking about climate change had changed, but coming from the British government, where the EU ETS was just beginning, the UK voluntary carbon market was underway, the EU ETS was forming, and we were seeing what was happening in the Northeast, and then particularly interested in the passage of AB 32 in 2006, I believe it was. And we worked very closely with the California state government to facilitate exchanges, lessons learned, techniques around developing a carbon market, embedded carbon trading experts in the California state government, held delegations and exchanges back and forth. And I would sort of have this debate with my British colleagues about, they're, in the diplomatic world, very focused on the federal government, on the White House. Even understanding the role of Congress was sort of something new, let alone governors, states, regulatory bodies at the state level, and then beyond that. So we'd have these debates about the relative value of the time spent and the investment that that the UK government was having. And I feel like I won those debates, but it was an interesting test to constantly sort of defend that type of work, those types of collaborations. I think 20 years ago almost that was pretty new. It was a new concept when it came to working on climate change. And I just kept finding myself in my career going more local. And I went to the state, at California EPA, and eventually made my way back home to Los Angeles, something I never thought I would do, work in local government, never even crossed my mind. And it's just been an incredible venue to get things done, and it's not to say that that's easy at all, and it absolutely has depended on partnerships, but everything from tackling a zero carbon grid, since we own and operate a city like Los Angeles, which is not too far from here. In LA, we own and operate the largest municipally owned electric and water utility in the country. We own and operate the Port of Los Angeles, which combined with Long Beach, with the Port of Long Beach, is the busiest port in the Western Hemisphere. The airport is owned and operated. LAX, apologies if you went through it and had any negative experiences, but LAX is a municipally operated airport, and so when you think about the opportunity for impact and the responsibility that a city like Los Angeles has for impact is huge, and the platform, if we choose to take it, and under Mayor Garcetti, for whom I worked for the last 8 years. He chose to take that sort of global platform responsibility and opportunity that a city like Los Angeles can and should have. And, we mobilized mayors all over the country through climate mayors, which was really about a voice and having a bully pulpit, using that platform, as well as some deep technical work internationally with our colleagues and counterparts across the world through his leadership in C40, which I know we'll be able to talk about. So that is sort of how I've thought about the ability to get things done at a multi-jurisdictional level, not only on your own, but in partnership.
I love that, and it tees me up perfectly for my question for Anna, which is, Governor Inslee has been such a leader, obviously, within Washington State on climate, but also really a leader on the global stage on climate, and I think that has driven a lot of really impressive and impactful collaboration with other states and other jurisdictions around the world. And, so I think Lauren just talked about I know sometimes it's, there are questions about like, why do that kind of cooperation? So I'm curious if you could just share a little bit about the kinds of collaboration that you and Governor Inslee have led for Washington State, and then, what's the impetus to do that?
Yeah, I think, for us, what Sarah had mentioned about, having states be pioneers and being able to lead, it's completely the case, right? We can move and test policies that are maybe a little bit too difficult to get past at the federal level. And so being able to have those test beds and be able to have proof points to then actually get traction to pass things nationally and to scale up is super important. But that said, Washington State is relatively small. My friends in California and New York love to joke that, like, Washington punches above its weight when it comes to climate space. They're always like, how does Washington think it's a big state? Because we have 7 million people, and when you compare it to the populations of California and New York, we have, I think, an outsized influence in this space. And it's really because of the leadership of Governor Inslee and understanding that, we as Washington State alone can do some really amazing pioneering policies and legislation, but that doesn't really move the needle in terms of actual emissions reductions, right? Like, we're not going to get the emissions reductions at scale unless we're linking arms and making sure that we are then replicating that across the country and across the world. So when he who shall not be named took office, we saw that there was a huge void in climate leadership at the federal level. And at the time, Governor Inslee, along with California and New York, founded the U.S. Climate Alliance. And it was just the three of those governors who decided we need to make sure that, we don't have a lack of climate action in the U.S. while we have this president in office. It pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, and we knew that it was up to states to continue that work. And there's a lot of jurisdiction, particularly in the power sector, et cetera, that are just outside of the hands of the federal government anyway. So it was up to states to make sure that we were keeping the ball going in terms of continued emissions reduction. So they founded the U.S. Climate Alliance. We've grown it significantly over the past several years. Now we have I think we represent over half of the U.S. population, about 60% of the U.S. GDP are all members of the U.S. Climate Alliance. And, we've seen our economies grow while we are significantly reducing emissions compared to other states who are not part of the alliance. So that's where we really, that's where we knew we had to act as a collective, because we won't be able to see the mitigation that we need to actually be able to fight this climate crisis.
That's great. And I think, we talked a little bit earlier about there are these critical opportunities, as you mentioned, U.S. Climate Alliance, for collaboration, for, continuing the political momentum, continuing sort of messaging to the rest of the global community about U.S. Commitment to the Paris Agreement and intentions there. And then we also talked a little bit in preparation for this panel about sort of taking that down a level to sort of the cooperation and the value and importance of cooperation, on specific areas. And, I don't know if you want to have anything you want to say and follow up on, particular areas of collaboration that have been really fruitful for Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it honestly just, when we have these types of coalitions, it kind of creates a safe space to talk policy and challenges, and we're able to work on issues collaboratively. So, for example, right, when you talk about clean transportation, a lot of folks were like, that's fantastic. We love the work that California is doing with advanced clean cars, advanced clean trucks, ACC2. We want to see that be successful. But it was challenging we were hearing from states that say, well, I can't defend to my legislature or my state that we're going to follow California's footsteps because it just seemed a little too taboo in markets. But if you could get smaller states that other states could kind of see themselves in, also joining hands and saying, we're also going to move in this way. We were able to really talk through how do folks adopt advanced clean cars? How do we, how did they do their rulemaking process? We actually, and also in the same way of trying to make sure that we're implementing at the state level, use that power to also then, help shape and influence federal policy. So we are, as a collective, engaging EPA and making sure that we actually see those waivers approved, so that we can all follow suit and be able to have 100% new vehicle sales be electric by 2035. So I think those are the ways that it's not just a bunch of policy nerds sitting in a room brainstorming. It's actual, results in real policy change and laws being enacted, and also a collective voice that is harder for the federal government to ignore, because we are able to move faster and push policy further than I think the national government would otherwise be comfortable with. And it's harder. While you can maybe overlook 1 or 2 governors, it's hard to ignore 25 governors who are all telling you that they need to see, executive action and leadership at the federal level.
Yeah. One thing, and I think obviously, for the audience here, there are a lot of people, and I sat in on a panel yesterday about, the state of the carbon markets and the opportunities for linkage. And I think when a lot of people think about state collaboration, the sort of default is linkage. That's the only mechanism of, state collaboration that is important or matters. And I guess, Serge, I'm interested in hearing from you. There are lots of different types of collaboration, not just with states, but with, not just with states domestically, but also with states globally. If you could talk about some of the types of collaboration that you're seeing at ARB that you feel have been really impactful.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to start with carbon markets, our cap and trade program has obviously been linked with Quebec's for about a decade now. So that's kind of 100% linkage. But in addition to that, we, have ongoing conversations with other jurisdictions in Mexico about the pilot emissions trading scheme that they're trying to put together, or they are putting together. We talk with the UK, we talk with Panama, we talk with New Zealand, we talk with folks at RGGI. We've really benefited from their experience in our early days in the EU ETS. And the list goes on and on. That's just a small sample of the jurisdictions that we speak with. And in addition, we co-chair the International Carbon Action Partnership, or ICAP, and we reach a membership of over 35 jurisdictions around the world, some national, some subnational. And the value add there is really sometimes just showing what's possible. That you can, for example, when we started our cap and trade program, it was kind of around the Great Recession. And over the course of the last, almost 20 years, we've really, or 15 years or so, we've seen that California's become the 4th largest economy in the world while continuing to push down our emissions. So just seeing examples like that, I think, is really helpful for other countries and jurisdictions around the world who are looking at the crisis in Ukraine and thinking about how unstable things may feel, and is it the right time to start a big, new, ambitious program like this? So talking through what our experiences have been, I think, is just gives them just an example to lean on, and then talking through some of the nitty-gritty details, like how do you staff a cap and trade team? These are big questions we get all the time. How do you set up monitoring, and verification programs? And with some countries, we have to work with other partners because the legal framework isn't really in place in a country. So sometimes we partner with the State Department, who also is helping a country set up just a basic legal framework that will enable them to do a big program like cap and trade. And so we have just a ton of engagement, and it's hard to sum it up and quantify it and say, like, this is the effect all of this international collaboration is having, but we know that it is moving the needle, and we keep those relationships and value them very much so. I don't know if you want me to talk about other sectors as well, but...
Well, I know one area we did talk about was transportation also in our conversation. I'm sure there are folks here who are also interested in transportation, low carbon fuel standard, other areas of collaboration. So yeah, if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of, both kind of on the private sector and the public sector, low carbon fuel standard is of interest to a lot of people outside of California. There's a whole panel on that. And there's a kind of a growing interest also in from airline industry, companies that are kind of just see fuels as a big part of their business. The vehicle standards that California has both adopted and then set regulations for is obviously something that others really look to us to learn more about. I think in the last couple years at COP and other big events, we've seen a lot of jurisdictions set ambitions and say, we're going to go to 100% sales of zero-emission vehicles by 2035 too, or even sooner. But how do you do that? How do you set up an enforceable regulatory pathway where that's going to happen? That is something that we get asked a lot. I think one of the things that California can add to the technology space, whether it's cars or trucks, is just the size of our market. We're just a huge state, and we buy a lot of cars. And so when automakers are looking at tooling up their supply chains and their factories to meet our demand, it makes sense to kind of swing all one way or all the other way. And another thing that the size of our technology market I've seen shift is just how neighboring jurisdictions are going to accommodate zero-emission vehicle drivers from California. So we have conversations with Baja and Baja Sur about setting up EV infrastructure so that drivers from California can continue to come and be tourists in their states, which brings a lot of money to them. So I think the size of our market and how global both our consumption and the production that feeds into the state have a huge subnational push on climate policy and other jurisdictions. And I'll let you talk about ports, actually. That's another big one that's growing, too.
All right, ports. Yeah. What do you want to say about ports, Lauren?
Well, a couple things and just reflecting what I've heard so far, it just made me think, Mayor Garcetti used to joke that good mayors borrow and great mayors steal. And it's just sort of a recognition and an acknowledgement that there's great things happening all over the world, and it's really important to not be so insular that you kind of miss out on partnerships and on opportunities to learn and replicate and get some of that scale. One of the most beloved new-ish programs in the city of Los Angeles is our Blue LA EV car share program, which, when I see people driving around in a Blue LA vehicle, I am so just heartwarmed and just want to roll down, I don't know why I went like this, but roll down a window and just say, how's it going? And it's just an incredible service, and it's focused on low-income drivers in low-income neighborhoods, but we got that idea from Paris. And there's a program that they actually pulled from Indianapolis. And so it's really neat to just be aware of and value what's going on in the world around you. And, then we'll get calls from the State Department who are trying to advance policy priorities and democracy around the world. And they're looking at cities or states and what programs, do you have that, we're looking in this region or that region could really help them. And so it's just this really nice growing community of collaborators. And I heard you talk about scale as well. And one of the areas that, as a city, really needing to band together to get scale when it comes to things like moving an EV market. And as a city with a relative amount of scale, we saw that it's kind of ridiculous that we would be able to access a set of, a menu of electric vehicles to procure into our fleets, but our, friends in Madison or Ann Arbor or other places may not have access to the same vehicles, or the price point is totally different in terms of what they would face in procuring the same vehicle. And so we were really trying to think, how do we accelerate the transition to electric vehicles in city fleets? And we're able to come up with a construct called the Climate Mayor's EV Purchasing Collaborative that would enable all cities and now other entities, counties and other entities, public entities, can buy off of a single contract that's been competitively bid, that meets all the procurement requirements of public entities. And it also got us in the door, in a different way, talking to car companies, not about the policies that we were going to and mandates putting on them, but the carrots. We can bring you not just a purchase of 1,000 vehicles from Los Angeles. We can bring you 5,000 vehicles, and then we opened up the platform, kind of figured that out, opened up the platform to EV transit buses and EV school buses. So really trying to get at scale through that kind of unique collaboration. And I feel like transportation keeps coming back as a theme. On the off-road transportation side, as I mentioned, the Port of Los Angeles is a pretty, we're pretty bullish on zero emission transition. And a lot of that is thanks to and facilitated by CARB in a lot of ways, both with the funding, from the funding side, and also just the policy and regulatory signals that are being sent very clearly on ships, on trucks. But being kind of the operators of the port gives us the opportunity to go out to ports on the other side of the lines, and find some of the like-minded operators. And we've actually been working now quite closely for a number of years with Shanghai, which is one of the busiest, largest shipping corridors between Los Angeles and Shanghai, for a number of years, to really put together the plan for the first zero-emission ship to travel across the busiest corridor in the world, and bringing in the Amazons and the IKEAs together, and partnerships across China and the U.S., and not just doing this on our own, but realizing that the federal government would have an interest in the fact that we were doing this, and working kind of in lockstep with, these are the conversations we're having. It was easier to have a conversation at the city level than, frankly, at the national levels between the U.S. and China. And so that was, looking at how we can fill gaps, but also lead the pack. That has led to a similar effort between LA and Singapore and ports across Australia as well. So it's an exciting way to kind of pull technology, while also doing right by local communities. Basically, of course, the Port of Los Angeles is one of the most polluted parts of the country. And so really needing to find those partnerships in order to hasten that transition.
Yeah. I would love to take some questions from the room. So if anybody has a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring it in. But one of the I just kind of wanted to summarize, because I think it was interesting in the prompt for this session, there was a question about what are the pitfalls of subnational collaboration. And in the preparation for this panel, we were talking about that. And I think as we've talked here, we've heard a lot about the benefits, obviously, around, maintaining political momentum despite headwinds. There's sort of broad messaging benefits. There are goal-setting benefits. There are very concrete benefits around things like procurement, individual areas of policy. And It's just been really interesting. So for me here, I'm just going to take a little prerogative of the moderator, but I've been working in carbon markets for about 15 years, seen it through sort of the financial crisis, the bottom falling out of the EU ETS, et cetera. And now we're here at this carbon markets conference where it just feels like sort of a resurgence of all this interest in a market. It really feels like a flashback to sort of 2007, 2008 in a lot of ways. And I think one of the things when people talk about sort of pitfalls, I don't know that they're pitfalls so much as misaligned expectations, right? In 2008, 2009, I lived in a world where I was working on the assumption that Waxman-Markey was going to pass. We were building a cap-and-trade program in California, but we really thought we were going to be preempted by the federal government. Hoping that we were going to be preempted by the federal government. That world didn't come to pass. But at the same time, I don't think I could ever have, in my wildest dreams, envisioned a world where we would have the level of investment from IRA and IJA, which is something that our firm spends a lot of time working on. And a lot of that, I think, has been enabled by this incredible subnational cooperation that has both kept the lights on when we didn't have federal leadership, shown the path of how it's possible, demonstrated the economic benefits both at the city level, as Anna was saying, just the economic impact of the states who are members of the U.S. Climate Alliance, right? Obviously, California is the fourth largest economy in the world, shown it's not only possible but beneficial. And so I do think there is this, we're in this funny place, right, where it's sort of carbon markets are back. It was really fun to see the panel with Washington talking about their carbon market, and it's California's not the only one talking about a carbon market on a panel. Really incredible to see that, but I do think it's not the path that we thought we were going to take to get here, right? And so I don't know if it's pitfalls so much as just stopping and looking around a little bit and being oh wow, well, this isn't maybe how we thought we were going to get to this point 15 years ago, but we are at in this incredible place and standing on the shoulders of many giants in this room also. So that's my opining 2 cents, but would love to take some questions from folks in the audience if there are any questions. Otherwise, I have a whole pocket full of them, and I can keep it going for as long as we need. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think, there is obviously a need to make sure that federal funding goes out to states and is used in ways that maximize emission reductions and equity considerations. And also, I think a real opportunity, I'm curious if folks here have a thought on this, for that funding to create a positive flywheel of progress, because as we buy down the cost of technologies, as we demonstrate what's possible, hopefully we're shifting the Overton window of possibility on policy at the same time. So I don't know if anybody here wants to speak to that, but.
Well, in thinking about it, I think that the direction of policy at the federal, state, and local level, while not necessarily, as you say, what would have been sort of the cookie-cutter expectation 15 years ago, I think that it's okay that it's moving down this route because of the moment that we're in, where the federal government is taking up a certain type of responsibility to, in some ways, assure or ensure that the work that states and cities are doing can be supported financially. And I think there's probably a few additional belts and suspenders type of things on disclosure and other pieces that would be important for the federal government to have to take on without being the single arbiter that sort of displaces all the other work going on around the country. So I think that type of model can work. What remains to be seen at this really delicate moment is the deployment of all the resources that have come to bear, not just getting money out the door, but also, as I'm sure you all feel the pressure that we feel, which is how are we navigating the opportunities that we know are about to kind of floodgate open. We don't really understand the rules. We don't really know everything that is coming forward or how to prepare. We are, like, in LA, we are working with other cities to try to intel gather, maybe some competition feeling a little bit, but mostly some intel gather, because we do feel a little bit stronger together if we can say there's really what we need to see. But I think this is sort of this breakpoint moment that we don't really know how it's going to pan out, though I feel confident and excited for the moment that we are in, and ultimately how the pathway has ended up.
I'm happy to add to that, but
Yeah, why don't you go and then you can.
Yeah, I think the way I look at the federal funding, right, is that it is a necessary, it definitely accelerates the work that the subnationals are doing, states and cities, but I also kind of see it as complementary to that work, is more of like the carrot than the stick, and it definitely on its own cannot supplant the work that states and cities are doing in terms of setting regulations and mandates. But if we deploy it quickly and we get it out the door and we actually have these investments made in the next couple of years, then we can hopefully set ourselves on a path where we've now set a trajectory that is hard to undo, and we've shifted markets so that, we have like EV charging infrastructure up and down the West Coast and going across the country. When Sarah was talking about there's subnational collaboration happening beyond policy and actually going into actual infrastructure. Like, I'm personally really excited about the federal funding for transmission and how do we leverage that to actually have an RTO in the Northwest. That's something I'm always thinking about. And how do we have an EV charging corridor up and down I-5? And I refuse to call it the 5. I know how you Californians do, but not just for passenger vehicles, but also for electric trucks, et cetera. So I think there's a real opportunity, and it is terrifying, as Lauren mentioned, right? Like, we are scrambling to figure out how do we deploy this funding, how do we do it with very limited, staffing and capacity. Also not knowing what the program rules are, how do we shape the program rules to make sure that we can leverage the funding to complement our own policies and priorities. All of that is happening in real time as we're trying to stand up a carbon market and implement our new building standards, et cetera. So it's a ton happening at once, but is a once in a generation opportunity to really set ourselves on a fixed path that will be hard to undo and gets us on the right trajectory for meaningful greenhouse gas emissions reductions.
If I can just add one more thought before we take the next question. I completely agree with what everybody has already said, and I, just reflecting back to the path that we're on and kind of, is this the world we thought we would be in? Back when wax and marking was a real possibility, and now it kind of sounds adorable, but we actually thought it was going to happen. I think the role of the private sector has also really changed, and I think, back then the public sector and the private sector felt much more adversarial. California just got back from a trade mission to Japan with the Lieutenant Governor's office, and we brought along a ton of small clean tech, clean energy companies to talk to investors in Japan and vice versa. And there was a lot of kind of government-to-government exchange, but also just the cross-pollination of Japanese investment in clean tech in California, clean tech making its way to Japan. I think that the conversation and the public-private partnerships that are going across the borders is just a real testament to just the global transition that we're going to see in our lifetimes. And I think that's just, for me personally, a really amazing thing to be able to witness, and I do feel pretty optimistic about it. In terms of federal funding, it is this kind of once-in-a-generation opportunity, and if we can really use it to make public investments that the private sector won't make, particularly in infrastructure where it just doesn't pencil out for the private sector, I think that's where we really need to try to leverage those funds and I will say that for some of the big kind of carrot incentive subsidy programs, we have seen in some cases without regulation where that money has meant that like school districts just pay more for electric buses. And so you really need to complement that with real regulation and real assurances that it's not just going to be markups on clean tech. So I think it's really awesome. I think it's really important. I think that it's part of the piece of the puzzle, not the whole puzzle. And we're also totally scrambling to figure out, like, what do we do with this money? Can we hire somebody? We really need help. As one person at CARB said, I just hear a lot of acronyms with dollar signs, and I don't know which one is which. So I think we're working on it. I think it can be great. I think there's a lot of work left to do to make it have the impact that to make it meet its potential.
Yeah, the West Coast would be a market, and Reggie would take over the East Coast, and then there'd be something in the middle, and we would all link, and so we know the date of that. So my question is Washington thinking in any way about coming back in? Are we invigorating WCI coming in?
I've never been involved in those like specific conversations. I'll just say that, on the carbon market side, for sure, our team, who you all heard from Bill earlier, who asked the first question, I was like, you should introduce yourself, spent a lot of time, even just when we were developing the legislation for us to stand up our Cap and Invest program and give us the statutory authority to do that, was done in consultation with California and Quebec to make sure that we had laid the groundwork and had the foundation for us to eventually link our markets. So that is something that even, as we got the legislation passed, we did our rulemaking through the whole rulemaking process, and even now as we're just standing up the program, it has been in constant dialogue with the markets that we eventually want to link with to make sure that that's going to be possible in the future. I think that's where we see us having a sustainable path forward and being able to have a market that's robust and also where prices are manageable.
And I think that makes sense. I think you need to develop your own legs, get the program together, and then don't over-rush it because there'd be some blowback and some problems. But I think once you establish your cabinet system and people are into it, that then it really would be helpful to this market you're trying to make work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and it's important we can't do it completely in isolation, right? Because we don't want to establish rules that inadvertently make it hard for us to link in the future. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just add, with the benefit of not being in government, so I don't have to watch my words as much as other folks in government do. And I know we talked about this a little bit also on our prep call, is just the idea of linkage by degrees. And I've done some work on this for former Governor Brown at the California China Climate Institute, which he co-directs. We have a whole paper on linkage by degrees, which builds on the great work that has been done by RFF and Dallas Bertra. But, I think even just what always strikes me is that we forget that even the conversations that we're having, that California's had, obviously with Washington, that it had with the UK that helped inform California's program, that is at its most fundamental a linkage by a very basic degree, which is like we have set up systems that have some of the same foundational sort of building blocks for environmental integrity and rigor and quantification and verification. And while those obviously don't result in fully linked markets yet, and maybe they will and maybe they won't, it does, lay the foundation for that possibility, while at the same time, I think, just creating sort of like important environmental circumstances that make the programs themselves, even if they're individual programs, robust. So, yeah. Do we have other questions? We've got 5 minutes. Oh, we got one over here. All right.
So when discussing potential subnational collaboration
thoughts?
I'm not our carbon market expert, full disclosure, so I can't really comment on that.
Sarah Jo?
Well, I know that we have kind of really laid out rules about how we would consider linking with another program, and I'm not the expert who knows what all those rules are, but I know that it's a pretty rigorous process to see, how and if they are aligned under certain metrics. One example would just be level of rigor. Do we have the same targets? But I think there's value there in obviously broadening the market and giving, finding more low-cost emissions reductions possibilities and all of those good things. But I do think Aimee is right that kind of standardizing some of the ways in which carbon markets just hold integrity for climate policy in general. Like, are you monitoring your emissions? Can you verify and all of that? I think there's a lot of sharing and a lot of technical people. I think if you talk to people at different, whether it's Washington, California, Reggie, they all know each other. Like, these people talk to each other, and there's a lot of alignment in terms of best practices. And I think that in some ways, those building blocks, those fundamental building blocks, not just for carbon markets, but again, for like climate policy in general, like, can we measure our emissions and our emissions reductions? I think there's a lot of alignment behind the scenes there already. And I think that you just can't undersell the importance of that.
Just a quick thought. When I worked at the California EPA in 2010 and 2011, well, particularly in 2010 under Governor Schwarzenegger, it was a lot of work with WCI. It was a wonderful time, wonderful opportunity to liaise and coordinate with so many different states across the West. My memory of it, as you say, is it does have to be pretty specific. There's so much legality associated, with linking and with developing a carbon market that passes all kinds of liabilities. So I do think from that standpoint there has been quite a significant amount of detail associated with the individual kind of rules and the regulation, but perhaps in enabling legislation, the enabling authorities, those can be much more broad and kind of tip your hat towards certain types of things that an individual jurisdiction may want to emphasize more than another jurisdiction. But it really, in order for a commodity to be able to be fungible, there's a need for some pretty uniform standards in a lot of the key parts of program design.
Yeah, I would maybe just add that I think in addition to the technical requirements of equivalence of environmental rigor, there are the considerations that people don't always think about, which are sort of maybe a higher level, some of the political considerations around linkage. And then there are also the sort of like more mundane questions about just like currency that people also don't think about. During my time at Cal EPA, we had the linkage with Quebec, and then we had the linkage and unlinkage with Ontario. And it takes an incredible amount of work and staff time to effect a linkage. And so I think, at least, and again, I have the benefit of not being in government, so just speaking for myself personally, but I think, being really thoughtful about what the political futures of the places that a potential linkage might look like because of the possibility of having to undo something that will have, serious ramifications again for staff time, but also for the market itself. So we are at time. I just heard applause in the other room, so I think that calls it. Yeah. Thank you guys so much for coming out and listening. Thank you to these incredible panelists, and thank you for all you do on climate.